Welcome to the Book of Mormon Evidence podcast with host Rod Meldrum. This week's Come Follow Me supplemental study is Lesson 5.3, 1 Nephi 16 through 22. I will prepare the way before you. This week's guest is Boyd Tuttle, president of Legends Library Publishing. In September 2019, Boyd was privileged to accompany British explorer and former naval captain Philip Beale in a replica Phoenician ship, which attempts to prove that ancient peoples could have reached America 2,000 years before Christopher Columbus. Who were the first sailors to cross the Atlantic and discover the Americas? History records Christopher Columbus. However, sailors could have reached the Americas 2,000 years before Columbus. They were inventors of the alphabet, creators of blown glass, discoverers of purple dye, instigators of global trade. Colonies on the eastern side of the Atlantic. They could sail west to Egypt, Greece, Carthage, Magna Graecia, which is today's Italy, Sardinia, Spain, up to England and Ireland, and down to Senegal on the western side of Africa. Did the greatest sailors of antiquity reach the New World? Some believe so. Philip Beale, former Royal British Navy, writer, adventurer, and sailor, will brave the Atlantic Ocean on Phoenicia, a Phoenician ship replica. The expedition, known as the Phoenicians before Columbus, will sail from Carthage, Tunisia, to Spain and Morocco, the Mount of Gibraltar and Cadiz, Spain, down to Morocco, Essaouira, Canary Islands, and then west over the Atlantic Ocean.
With your help, the expedition will enable us to prove that the Phoenicians could have reached the Americas. Please donate to become involved and make this great adventure possible, changing people's view of history forever.
Welcome to another edition of the Book of Mormon Evidence streaming podcast, and we're excited about we have a special guest with us today. We have Boyd Tuttle. He's a publisher, and he also has some really interesting experience that deals directly with the early part of the Book of Mormon. So we're excited about that. Those of you who are joining us, this is from the Come Follow Me manual. In the last few weeks, we have covered things from the introduction. The next section here was the 1 Nephi chapters 8 through 10, then chapters 11 through 15. Today, we're going to be talking about 1 Nephi chapters 16 to 22. And in those chapters, specifically in chapter 17, it talks about a very specific voyage. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, again, so we have some context here and an understanding as far as this is concerned. So we have the Abraham who has a covenant that is given to him on this promised land called Canaan. That promised land is basically the Levant area around Israel and that area. You have the 10 tribes in the north, and then you have the two southern tribes. The 10 tribes have now been, in this particular case, basically the 10 tribes have been drawn off. The 10 lost tribes of Israel, as we all know them as. Mm-hmm. And then the two southern tribes are left. Lehi has been trying to convince them that they need to repent because of this vision or dream that he had. And then they leave through the desert. We have now Lehi and his family have arrived now on the shoreline of the Great Deep, basically Ariantum, they call it. Now, as they go through this, I wanted to share just a couple of things here with you. They have been going now through the desert here for about 8 years.
Right.
It specifically says that they did travel nearly eastward from that time forth. It's in 1 Nephi chapter 17. They went down around the borders of the Red Sea. That's in 1 Nephi chapter 16, which are part of this week's lesson here. And then Ishmael dies in a place called Nahum. We're going to have more discussion about that. And then they end up in this Land Bountiful area. Now in the Land Bountiful, they find, interestingly, they find ore, and they find that there's apparently wood or trees to make some ships. And a lot of people are not familiar with an amazing voyage that happened just a few years ago. And I wanted to show you, this is Lehi's ocean route for 8 years, and then this is a ship that was built, and that was something that was done way back in 2008 and 2009. And then the idea was that they were going to build a ship. Now, let me just give you a little background about this particular thing. There's a history that was written by a historian by the name of Herodotus. And Herodotus wrote this history, and in this history, he talks about how there was this people called the Phoenicians. And who are the Phoenicians? Well, basically the people who lived on the west coast of what is now Israel, essentially, in what's called Phoenicia, and that they were making circumnavigations of Africa, according to his history, clear back before Lehi's time.
Around 600 BC is when Herodotus suggested that they were possibly circumnavigating Africa.
Yeah, because he was about 500 BC, and then so they say 100 years before us, these people were doing this.
Right.
As now we know from history, and I think Boyd's going to tell us a little bit more about that actually the Phoenician culture and the seafaring tradition actually extends even way beyond that. But in Herodotus' his history, he talks about how these Phoenicians knew how to make these circumnavigations around Africa. So there was a group of individuals from the UK. One of them is probably by the name of Philip Beale, and he decided that he has done other expeditions kind of like this, and he decided he was going to do a new expedition. But first, they needed to have a ship.
Right.
Now let's go for just a second to what it says in the Book of Mormon about the particular ship that Nephi made. And this is from 1 Nephi chapter 17, verse 17. It says, "When my brethren saw that I was about to build a ship, they began to murmur against me, saying, 'Our brother's a fool, he thinks he can build a ship. Yea, and he also thinks he can cross these great waters.'" I find it interesting, first off, when Nephi went and found out and got this directive, and he came back and told Laman and Lemuel, that Laman and Lemuel's response wasn't, "What's a ship?"
Right.
Right. Why do you think that they knew about ships?
So the Phoenicians were sailing as early as 1000 BC. So they were already
long before
operating for more than 500 years. They had a well-established trading route all over the Mediterranean, and as Herodotus suggested, even enough to circumnavigate to the great continent of Africa. And so the concept of shipping was not a new concept to the Israelites. They were well aware of it. They were only lived 100 miles from the seashore, from Jerusalem, and many goods, were being traded and being brought into the city that were being shipped in.
So if that's the case, then Laman and Lemuel clearly knew about ships and shipbuilding. So why did they say, "Our brother's a fool"? As I look at that, they probably knew what it took to build a ship. Now, I have to cut back to just a little bit here, because Boyd is one of the few individuals in the whole world, and one of the only individuals within the church that has actually made portions of a voyage on the ship. There's a couple of others who have done that on the earlier edition. Boyd just got back just a few months ago from a second voyage, and I'm going to let him tell all about that one and why this is so critical. But this ship was actually built in Awad, Syria. Individuals from the UK, there's probably some of the foremost experts in ancient maritime sailing and vessels and so forth in the whole world. And they said, you know what, we're going to see if we can actually do this voyage. We're going to basically go from Saudi Arabian Peninsula. We're going to essentially sail around Africa, back into the Mediterranean, and we're going to prove to the world that Herodotus' history is actually doable in a 600 BC ship. Well, how do they know what these 600 BC ships look like?
So let me talk about that, because I became very intimately familiar with this ship, living on board for a number of weeks. But the ship was built, like you said, off the coast of Syria using traditional building methods. So it was built in the same manner they didn't allow any power tools. It was very much just handmade the same way it would have been made thousands of years ago. And they use a variety of different woods. They use a special joint called the Phoenician joint, actually has its name.
Really?
And how did they know how to do that is because they actually found a ship that had been shipwrecked off the coast of Marseille, France, called the Jules Verne 7. And that ship was largely reconstructed, brought up, and so forth, and it's in a museum now.
So this ship was actually kind of semi-intact,
yeah,
portions of it.
And it is dated to 600 BC. The ship that they found at the bottom of the sea and then restored or recovered was intact enough that they could identify the exact kind of woods, the exact kind of joints that they used, and it's a very sophisticated joint. I mean, we can show it on the screen, is how they had, if you're familiar with a dado type of joint, they would use one kind of wood for the outside and one kind of wood for the dado or the connector, and then they would put wooden pegs in to hold it all together, the dowels to hold it together, and the wood in the middle that makes up the dado actually expands more than the wood that it's in. So it strengthens the seal and literally binds this ship together in an amazing, remarkable way that this was put together. As a crew member on that ship, we endured some very rough seas in the middle of the Mediterranean for a whole night with 20 and 30 foot swells. I mean, the yardarm.
How big is the ship?
The ship is it's 67 feet long, 20
that's the
20
typical
meters.
Size of a Phoenician ship, right?
Yeah, this would be called a Phoenician merchant vessel. They also had a lot of military-style defensive vessels that were just manned with lots of men, and they were made for speed and for defensive purposes.
Did they have oars, or how were they?
They would have oars.
Okay.
But
this ship does not have.
The merchant vessels also had oars, but they were primarily just used for getting around in harbors and when they had to go upwind or something like that, where they couldn't. These ships were only capable of sailing before the wind. It only had a single sail, a broad sail, that essentially you had to have the wind blowing at your back, and you would just go. You could go 5 degrees north or south.
Yeah, let's address that for just a second, because I wanted to talk about the construction of the ship itself. This is from the Book of Mormon account. In the Book of Mormon account, it says, this is 1 Nephi chapter 18, verses 1 and 2. It says, "It came to pass that they did worship the Lord, and did go forth with me, and we did work timbers of curious workmanship. And the Lord did show me from time to time after what manner I should work the timbers of the ship. He says, Now I, Nephi, did not work the timbers after the manner which was learned by man, neither did I build the ship after the manner of man, but I did build it after the manner which the Lord had shown unto me, wherefore it was not after the manner of men." Now, a couple of things that I get from that, and I want to get your kind of comments on this. It says, basically, it's a wooden ship.
It's a wooden ship.
And it also says it was curious workmanship, which means it's not something that they were at least aware of or used to. So there's something different about it. But I want to just notice a couple of things. Number one, the Lord didn't ask them to build an aircraft carrier,
right.
Right. And it wasn't a power ship. It was a wooden sailing ship, which is the reason why we think that this is a good analog. This Phoenicia expedition ship is actually a really good analog to what Lehi and Nephi and Lemuel would have built at that time.
Well, let me add to that, because you got to realize, so the Phoenicians have been building these ships for hundreds of years, and they've had many years to perfect their design through trial and error or whatever, to reach the degree of sophistication that they did on these ships. And, for example, they would use Aleppo and Mediterranean pine. They would use walnut and Mediterranean oak, and they would use cypress fir, and each one offered a different property that had been perfected, that they had perfected for the purpose that it was used for. It wasn't just randomly pull a plank and throw it in there. Every bit was. Now you think about the time and generations of ships it would take to get to that level of perfection. Yeah. I believe that the Lord, was kind of giving Nephi a shortcut on how to get all that stuff
Download.
through Revelation. He showed him how that was done, and obviously he had no knowledge of how that was being done. The Phoenicians themselves kept it very secret, so it wasn't like it was broadly known. That was their strength, that was their power, and they didn't give it away freely.
Yeah, but they must have known how difficult this was and how many years it took for the Phoenicians to learn how to do this, which is probably the reason why Lemuel turned to Nephi and said, "Our brother's a fool. He thinks he can build a ship."
Exactly. It would be like
they weren't shipwrights. I mean,
it would be like
they were traders.
You going to your brothers or family and saying, "I'm going to build a rocket ship and fly to the moon."
Exactly.
I mean, they're like, "You're a fool. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's impossible."
Yeah.
That was the same kind of thing.
But again, I just want to bring back the fact that they didn't. Lemuel's response wasn't "What's a ship?" Because clearly people knew what a ship was from how long? When was one of the earliest ships that we know of? Noah's Ark.
Noah, yeah.
So people have known how to build a ship, or at least about ships, even clear back until Noah's Ark time.
Sure.
And so clearly they knew about this. So he talked about this. So now a couple of quick things then about the original edition, or the original expedition, I should say. And that is that they basically they followed down the just like in the Book of Mormon talks about, they followed down the Red Sea, got over onto the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. There's a couple different places there that have interesting aspects of that topography, and also inlets and things that where they could actually build the ship in there, and the wood and the oars to be able to make the metal tools that they needed to be able to build the ship. And so all those things are things that weren't known before, but now they're known about these things, and it's actually proving out the story of the Book of Mormon. How would Joseph Smith possibly know this clear back in his time frame?
A good example is that we know that the ancient Phoenician ships, because of the wreck that they found, actually used iron nails. Mm-hmm. That was part of the construction, and so we know that they had the ability to smelt iron and use it for the shipbuilding.
Right, but they weren't using it for beams and so forth. They were using it to help hold things together.
Hold it together. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
basically, a couple of quick things then. So the Phoenicia expedition, the first expedition that we're going to talk about, is the verification of Lehi's ocean voyage. A lot of members of this church do not even know, are not even aware, that Lehi's ocean voyage, not only has it been done, it's been done in a 600 BC replica ship in our time and verified. No one knew that. In fact, I find this interesting, even the people who were doing the expedition didn't realize where it was going to lead them, and so we're going to get to that in just a second. But let's go back for just a second to where they started from.
Well, the ship ended up in a place called Salalah, Oman. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they went to Salalah, they normally would have not gone that far east across mm-hmm. the Arabian coast. But because of something that was going on back in 2008, 2009, you'll remember the Somali pirates were a problem in those days. And Philip Beale, the captain of the ship, who, by the way, did not know anything about the Book of Mormon or Lehi's voyage or anything to that effect, wanted to avoid the Somali pirates, and so he moved himself further east.
They were on the Horn of Africa.
Yeah,
where
they were right on the Horn. Yeah, and so they decided to skip that and move further east out, and they ended up in Salalah, Oman, and that was their official starting place. He had no idea that many LDS scholars believed that Salalah was potentially Nephi's Bountiful. He had no understanding of that, but that's where he started, just by coincidence.
Now, a couple of things. First off, so we know that Lehi's ship, it says that there's a couple of scriptures that he brings up, that he said that that they gathered fruit and honey in abundance. Right. They all got aboard the ship and were blown before the winds. Well, if they're blown before the winds, what does that tell us? That they're not going against the winds. Now, a couple of quick things about that. The ship that you're talking about here has an interesting hull. Around 1100 AD, so long after this expedition, ships began to be built with a hull that kind of went from the sides that came down this way, and then it makes a deep keel. It has a big V keel, which allows the ship to basically be able to tack against the wind to some extent. Mm-hmm. This ship didn't have a deep V hull. Right. What does that do to your sailing capability?
Yeah, so you're limited, obviously. If you try to sail, let's say if your cross purposes to the wind, you're going to get blown sideways. You're just going to skid across the water like this. You cannot go forward with a wind that's coming at you from 90 degrees.
If you have a sail, doesn't it kind of tend to bend to pull the ship over sideways instead of
Yeah, it's going to pull the ship. And the ship is this kind of ship, a shallow hull ship, is only going to sail well and effectively when it has effectively a tailwind pushing it along. That's what it's designed to do, and they do very well with that. Yeah. And given the currents that they knew where they needed to place themselves at certain times of the year for the wind to carry them in whatever direction they needed to go.
Yeah. So now just being a devil's advocate here for just a second. So why couldn't the Lord have shown Nephi how to build a ship with a deep keel so they could sail against the wind? Well, clearly he could have done that, right? But basically he didn't need to. If they go this particular route, which we're about to talk to you about, if they went this route, they didn't need to have a deep keel, and we can say that with the certainty because they actually did it. Right. So this is not a question of maybe; it happened. Now, a couple of things. When did they leave? About I'll just kind of address this really quickly. Yeah. It says in the Book of Mormon that they gathered fruit and honey in abundance. Now, that's another important thing. Isn't it interesting that the Book of Mormon just gives us just exactly enough information so that we can know with certainty which direction they went? Because a lot of people thought that they went east, went through Indonesia and so forth, and then went up and ended up on the west coast of America. But there's actually a ship that actually tried that. And what happened to that ship? That was called the Jewel of Muscat. And they actually tried to do this, and they ended up having to be pulled by powered ships. Right. To be able to make it to, I think they were going to Singapore, if I remember correctly. Okay. And they left from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. They couldn't even do it. It was so contrary to the winds and the currents that they couldn't even get there. Right. But if they followed the natural winds and currents, now some people say, well, God could change all the winds and currents. Well, yeah, he might be able to do that. Certainly he could. Okay, but he doesn't need to. Right. Why wouldn't he give him instead this? The Leahona, say, now you get down to this point and then you build a ship, and you don't have to have all this specialty stuff about the deep keel and all that kind of stuff, because I'm going to send you to a place where you can just build a regular, more or less flat bottom, not flat, but a rounded bottom ship, and you'll still get there. Right. Now, the interesting thing also about that part about that they gathered fruit and honey in abundance. When do they have fruit and honey in abundance? On the Saudi Arabian Peninsula.
In the fall.
It's in the fall.
Also,
they're the northern hemisphere, so they basically have the same kind of.
There's also the fact that they are Hebrew. These are Jewish people, and they followed the Jewish practice of harvesting in the fall. So it's whether the climate dictated it or not, that would have fallen into the time frame that they would have done their harvest by tradition and by religious rite.
Yeah, see, and I actually contacted some honeybee basically beekeepers over there, and also people who have the figs and so forth, because this area here is actually pretty lush. When the winds off of the Indian Ocean come up in there, it actually rains right along the coastline, and then as it goes in, it basically becomes just complete barren desert. Okay, but right there along the coast, it's actually pretty decent. And if they had fruit and honey in abundance, and then that tells us right there what season of the year was it that Lehi had to have left.
In the fall of the year.
In the fall of the year. Yeah. Which brings us to the next big equation here. Which direction are the winds going along the Saudi Arabian Peninsula there in the fall of the year? Well, it turns out that there's only primarily two wind patterns about that. There's the wind pattern that comes up in the spring and summer, which comes up off the Indian Ocean and comes up along there. That's what brings the rainy season. This is what makes it so lush there. And then in the fall of the year, that wind pattern changes. Instead, it starts coming down out of India and that area, and basically blows down the opposite direction, kind of to the south and to the west. And that's the wind pattern that would have been happening in the fall of the year when they got the ship finished.
Well, and let's just to point out the fact that when Philip Beale left Salalah, Oman, it was October. That's right. And he had one choice of which way to go, and that was where the winds took him. And it took him right down the east coast of Africa to the Comoros Islands is where he had the first stop. And then,
which, by the way, just for the stop, so that word Comoros, what does that sound like in the Book of Mormon? Does that have any place name?
almost like Cumorah.
Doesn't that sort of sound like Cumorah to you?
And the capital of Comoros is an interesting name as well.
And I love this one. So
I'm sure it's just coincidence. I do think it's just coincidence, but it is interesting that the capital is spelled M-O-R-O-N-I. Moroni is the capital of Comoros Islands, and for what it's worth, there it is. And sure enough, they did stop there on their way down the coast of Africa.
Yeah. Now, basically, you can see in this illustration here just some of the ocean currents, basically, as they go. Basically, all of the southern currents of the oceans go in essentially a counterclockwise revolution, and then all of the northern oceans go in a clockwise revolution. So, if you leave the Saudi Arabian Peninsula and you head out here, the natural ocean currents are going to take you. Not only the ocean currents now, but the wind currents as well are going to take you basically down the east coast of Africa, right. Which is exactly what happened to the Phoenicia expedition. So they got down there, they went around they got down to the bottom of Africa, and then they had a really interesting thing that happened to them, and this is actually an interesting aspect of this as well, is they got into a huge storm.
That's
and
right.
you have actually experienced this. I want you to describe for me what it's like to be in a storm with 20-foot tall waves when you're in a 60-foot long ship.
Well, the ship fared well. The ship fared well.
But the people in it?
The people in it struggled a bit, let's just say that. But I was at the helm for 2 hours during that very fierce storm. It was at night. You really have no light other than what is just ambient at night. And you just have a compass that you keep your eye on all the time, and you're trying to keep the ship headed in the direction that we're trying to go. Now, in this case,
how much is it?
We were tipping at 45 degrees, so it's like a roller coaster ride. I mean, it's a real Disney ride. The yard arm, which is what holds the sail, it was dipping in the water on both sides, and that's how far we were tipping, and that was with the sail down. Okay, we didn't have the sail up during this. Why? Because the wind was actually driving us backwards. If you go back and look at our path, you'll see in the middle of the Mediterranean we take a little jog in the reverse direction. That was during the storm that we experienced. We had to deploy a storm sail for an anchor, so we actually put the storm sail out in the water. And it would balloon out
to slow you down.
To balloon out like a parachute underwater, and it slowed us down from being pushed back on the water. But nevertheless, we were pushed back all night and half the day.
Well, the reason why I think that's just absolutely fascinating, all of us know this story here. That in 1 Nephi, this is in chapter 18 of this lesson. It says, "There arose a great storm, yea, a great and terrible tempest, and we were driven back upon the waters for the space of 3 days." So you've actually experienced being driven back.
I have in our journey. Now let me tell you what happened to Philip in the exact place that I think Nephi would have had this experience. As he was going down around the Cape Horn of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope.
Yeah, the Cape of Good Hope
Cape
at the
of Good
bottom
Hope
of Africa.
At the very bottom where you have the Indian
By the way,
Ocean.
that was just from a time frame wise, that was about, so they in this expedition, let's give you some time frames here. So they left Salalah on October the 26th of 2009, which is just 10 years ago, approximately. It's been 10 years. Can you believe that? Then they departed the Comoros Islands about December the 20th of 2009. Then they got down into this storm happened on March the 2nd of 2010. This is when the main sail of the ship was actually torn to pieces. It's torn in half. They were in the same kind of thing, 20, 30-foot swells.
Let me tell you what happened.
Yes.
So on the ship, the crew saw the ship moving rapidly through the water. The waves were crashing toward the bow. It was making apparently great progress in a forward direction. But on their GPS, which they had, they could physically see that over land they were moving backwards.
How was that possible?
So the current literally was moving this faster than the wind was pushing them in the opposite direction. So they were literally plowing through the current, but not fast enough. So they were being driven back upon the waters. When I read that in Philip's book, and when I've talked to him about it since, it was a perfect description of what Nephi experienced.
Exactly what Nephi was experiencing when they're on the ship. Yeah, so that's, and again, that references 1 Nephi chapter 18, verse 13, being driven back upon the waters. So they ultimately they ended up having to actually put into land there in South Africa.
They
repairing the sails and
that's
so
right.
forth.
They had to rebuild the sail. They had to repair the mast, which had broken. They had a lot of damage that they experienced on that. We don't know how Nephi dealt with that, whether he had to pull into land or if they just fixed it on board.
But they could have. I mean, the interesting thing about the Book of Mormon, it never says that it never says, and we did sail to the promised land without stopping.
Right.
It never says that. But it never says that they stopped either, so we just don't know.
Let me just tell you, as someone who has been on a Phoenician ship, probably similar to Nephi's in size and capacity and so forth, when you're out in the ocean and you've been out there for a few weeks, when you see land, you go there. I'm just saying, fresh water becomes really, really intriguing at that point.
Yeah.
And fruit.
Fresh food
becomes super enticing to you after you've eaten canned foods and dry goods and so on and so forth, as we did, and potatoes and carrots that were quite wilted by the 3 weeks into the trip.
Yeah.
So I can imagine them stopping along the way.
And the interesting thing, if they go this particular route, they can stop anywhere along the entire east coast of Africa.
That's right.
Or on the Comoros Islands, or all through that. There's islands all through there. So they wouldn't have to be, basically, it would give them at least options as far as food and water and being able to, how much could they store. The interesting thing about this is, though, to me, is if they go the other way that people have basically suggested that they went, instead they went to the east. Well, first off, they'd be going against the currents. Secondly, they'd have to cross the world's largest ocean, the Pacific Ocean, at literally its widest point, with no place to land to be able to replenish.
Yeah.
Which is the reason why the church got kicked in the teeth by these couple of documentaries put out by the History Channel called Who Really Discovered America. And they actually came out and said, a ship could make it, but the ship would make it with dead people because it'd take a minimum of 380 days for them to make this route, to make a West Coast landing on Central America.
Yeah,
and there's nothing that says that they made a West Coast landing or that they landed in Central America. So this is a route that actually makes a lot of sense. And the cool thing about it is we don't have to say we wonder or we think it might have gone this way. We can say this has actually been done. But the magic happened actually now. Now they're leaving South Africa.
The next leg of the trip was the key indicator to those of us who embrace the idea that Lehi sailed in a ship and reached the promised land. This was the key.
And the reason why, because originally when they set out there, in fact, this was part of their logo on the original voyage. They had the ship going down the east coast of Africa and then going up the west coast of Africa, and that was the plan all along. In fact, they even had several of the places where they were planning to stop actually laid out as to what they were going to do. What happened?
So what happened is they started heading out, and unbeknownst to them, the wind and the currents did not allow them to stop anywhere on the west coast of Africa. It took them directly west, further west, across the Atlantic Ocean, pointing them toward Brazil for the longest time. They thought they might make contact in Brazil.
I remember reading the ship's logs at that point in time, and they were kind of freaking out. They're going, we can't get the ship back to Africa because of the hull design, which is important in this whole thing. They couldn't tack against the wind. They had to go where the winds took them, and the winds were taking them further and further away from Africa and closer to South America, to the New World. And they were out in the middle of the Atlantic at this point in time, and they're kind of like, now what?
Yeah. There's an interesting episode in Brazilian archaeology, actually, of a stone that was found carved on the coastline at that point of Brazil, the furthest eastmost facing point, where there is a stone that had been carved on, and it was written in Phoenician. Okay, and it said, "We are Phoenician sailors. We were part of a 12 ships, and our ship, struck these and we've been shipwrecked here. May the gods save us." And it's all carved in stone. Now, interestingly, that stone has somehow disappeared, but there are drawings of it and so forth, and it continues on as kind of a mythology about that. A lot of people have called it a hoax, but it's remarkably doable and possible, especially given the Herodotus discussion, and now with Philip's circumnavigation, it's very easy to imagine that they could have ended up on the Brazilian coast, and even more likely somewhere in the Caribbean Sea, I should say.
Yeah. So basically, what ended up happening is, so they went up, they continued on up there. Now, this is another interesting aspect to me. They leave in the fall of the year, so they get a full contingency of food. They load the ship up with food and so forth for the voyage. They leave, but interesting now, the equator, if you take a look at kind of where the equator is, they're north of the equator. So when they get down to the equator, they're going south. Now, Keith Johnson was another guy who was at LDS, Latter-day Saint, and he also was with he was with the first expedition. And one of the interesting things that he said is, he asked them, well, what should I wear for the expedition? And he said, all you'll need is shorts and a t-shirt, because we're going to be going through the winter of the year as far as we're concerned. But as they cross over the equator, they're leaving in the fall of the year. When they cross over the equator, they're actually beginning to sail into summertime in the southern hemisphere. By the time they get around the bottom of Africa, basically South Africa, they're midsummer. Now they leave, they're coming up on the west side of Africa and into the Atlantic Ocean, and it's now waning summer. Now what happens is they now are getting back close to the equator. They cross over, and guess what the season is in the northern hemisphere as they cross over?
Springtime.
It's springtime in the northern hemisphere. And I think that's just absolutely fascinating for several reasons. But one of the biggest ones is that if you use the Phoenicia expedition as a precursor or a similar kind of a voyage to what Lehi did, what did Lehi do when he arrived here in the Promised Land, when they got here?
Planted seeds.
We know exactly what they did. This is from chapter 18, verses 23 and 24. He said, after we had sailed for the space of many days, and they didn't say several years, okay, this many days' journey, we did arrive at the Promised Land. And it came to pass that we began to till the earth and plant the seeds which we had brought from Jerusalem. And it came to pass that they did grow exceedingly. Isn't it interesting? When you take a look at for example, all of the explorers from Europe, when they left, whether it was Columbus, Cortez, Coronado, and all of those, the pilgrims, everybody, they couldn't leave the ports or the harbors there in Europe until after the ice had cleared out of the harbors from the wintertime, which means they had to leave sometime in early spring. Okay, so they didn't hit icebergs, because icebergs and ships and icebergs. Titanic comes to mind. Okay. So they can't really sail while there's icebergs and so forth going on. So they have to wait till the icebergs are out of the water, which means they can't leave till basically early spring to mid-spring. It only takes a few months to get across there. I'm going to let you talk about how long that takes, because this is the next thing that's so cool. I can't wait to share with everybody here. But basically, when they got here, they would always be here late in the fall. And so what did they do the first winter? They starved. But instead, if you follow God's plan, which is not, when you think about it, it's a way longer distance to go clear around Africa and everything else to get over here. Why not just go whoop across the Atlantic Ocean? Because you die. Okay.
Interesting.
So God actually took them around Africa, which takes way longer, but they're sailing into summertime, and it's summertime the whole way. Nobody's freezing. They don't even have to bring a coat. And basically, they make it all the way to America, and that's, I just find that just absolutely fascinating.
It's remarkable, and they land in the springtime of the year, and that's pretty much an analog to what Philip Beale did. If you take out his stops, the time to travel is exactly that. It takes you in the fall and lands you in the spring.
Yeah, and interesting enough, that's based on the Phoenicia expedition. They left in October of 2009. If we now apply that to the Book of Mormon, basically Lehi would have, let's just say that Lehi just happened to leave on October 26th of 590 BC. Okay, now October, we know it was in the fall of the year, so that's probably pretty close. That would then put, if they didn't, with the Phoenicia expedition, they actually stopped several times along the way. They wouldn't have to stop, though, because Lehi had all of his people with him, so they could actually just sail straight through. If that was the case, then according to the Phoenician expedition, it would have taken them 103 days, or just barely over 3 months, to go from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula to the south end of South Africa. So about 3 months time frame. Then it would have taken them about another, it means Lehi's arrival there in Cape Town, South Africa would have been somewhere around February the 6th of 589 BC, as he was rounding Africa. Again, may have stopped, we don't know that, but bottom line is if they follow the trajectory of the Phoenicia expedition the rest of the way, all the way up to America, that would have put their potential arrival of Lehi's landing party in North America April the 10th to April the 25th of 589 BC. And again, the significance of that is that they planted the seeds that they brought with them. Some people said, well, but would the seeds grow if they're coming from Israel? Would the seeds grow very well over here in America? Is it about the same latitude?
It's the exact same latitude.
It's the exact same latitude. Yeah. Now, we have put down Florida as a potential landing spot. Why did we pick Florida? And I'll just address this really quickly, and then we're going to go into your newest expedition. But the reason why we think that the Florida area may have been an area for Lehi's landing are numerous, but a couple of those main points are basically this. Number one, when Lehi arrived, he made a very prophetic statement. He says, "We have obtained the promised land." If the United States of America is the promised land, which we've been talking about in the previous podcasts and so forth, then he had to have his feet on the physical land that we now call America, or specifically the United States of America. Mm-hmm. Okay, number two, this is the natural place where a sailing ship would come in, because we know that the currents come in. That's where we've all followed the hurricane patterns, as they come up and they go up into the Gulf Coast, basically, area. So that's a natural wind pattern, which would make sense that Lehi would be in there. We also know that that's the same direction, basically, that most of the early explorers from Europe came in. They came into that general area from Columbus to Coronado and Cortez and so forth. They mostly all came into that general area as well. The next reason why we think it's probably there is because that's the earliest part of the ancient Hopewell mound builder people. The very first, earliest mounds and so forth that have been found are down there in that general area around Tallahassee, Florida, and they date into about between about 500 or 600 BC. So that's a pretty substantial reason as well. So this is the reason why we're thinking that's arrival would have been there. But ultimately, that whole thing would have been done in 103 days on the east side, and then 74 days over to basically Cuba, Puerto Rico, that area, and then about 15 to 20 more days up into Florida, making a total of 90 days on about 3 months on the east coast of Africa, 3 months getting to Florida. Right. 6 months journey. And the people at the History Channel could not have kicked the church in the teeth if they would have been aware of this expedition.
True.
So there was another famous expedition in the Book of Mormon that we don't hear a lot about, but there was another people that came over, and they weren't found until a little bit later, after Nephi and his family had left the land of first inheritance, and they moved up into the land of Nephi, and then they left the land of Nephi, and they went to the land of Zarahemla, and they found some other people there.
Let's talk about the Mulekites. So, right at the time that Jerusalem was being besieged by King Nebuchadnezzar, he, just because exactly what Lehi had predicted would happen if they did not repent, and they did not repent. And so the city was being sieged by the Babylonians, and after 3 months of this, the king of Jerusalem, whose name was Zedekiah, saw that the city was going to fall. So Zedekiah flees with his entourage, his family, and so forth, and they head across the plains of Jericho, heading for Jericho for safety, but they are caught by the Babylonians.
Yeah.
And the Babylonians soldiers take them to where King Nebuchadnezzar is in another city, and they bring Zedekiah and all of his sons, and there they line him up and tragically kill each and every son in the view of King Zedekiah. And when they're done with that, they blind Zedekiah by putting his eyes out, and as a sign or a symbol that your kingdom is over.
And also that the last thing you will ever remember in this life is watching your sons die.
Yeah. So the Babylonians were incredibly efficient and effective in destroying any possible claim or argument to the throne, right? Because that's always what happens with monarchies. You have some random person that claims, well, I'm the true heir to the king, and then they get the people to follow them and they overthrow So the Babylonians were very good at making sure that would never happen. What they did then was took Zedekiah back to Babylon and kept him there the rest of his life, so that he would be a living witness to anybody who tried to retake the kingdom. And he said, no, I know there were no errors. I saw all of them go. So here is the remarkable thing. In Genesis 49, the Lord, through his prophet, blesses the sons, all the sons of Jacob, right? Isaac gives his last blessing to all of his sons. And and we know about the blessings to Joseph because that's where the Book of Mormon comes from, and so on and so forth. But we rarely pay attention to the blessings given to Judah. And the blessing given to Judah is that the scepter shall never depart from thee. What this is to say is that the kingly line, the divine kingdom under the Jewish kingdom will continue this kingly line, which begins with David to Solomon and so on down through the lines until finally it comes to King Zedekiah. And many rabbis look at this and scratch their heads because they say, the Lord doesn't break his promises. And he promised that the scepter would not depart. So they struggle to understand what could have happened here that the Lord didn't keep his promise, that the scepter shall never depart from the kingdom would continue. Well, what we know, and we only can know this because we have the Book of Mormon, is that in fact there was a son of Zedekiah who was preserved, so allowed that promise to be kept. Now here's where we depart from the scriptures a little bit, and I will insert my own thinking on this, and it's part of the theme that I'm developing for a book I'm writing. And the thesis is that the only way Mulek could have survived is because he had not been born. He was still in the womb of his mother. The name Mulek means dear little king. Okay, that's from Hugh Nibley. That's from Hugh Nibley. Yep. Okay. So we know that he was either very young, and I assert that he hadn't been born. Had he been born, it would have been a matter of public record. And any king's son is born is a matter of public record. That is a big deal, right? Because he's a potential heir to the throne. And so I would assert that not only was Zedekiah unaware, but no one was aware except his mother. And so in the womb, she carried him out of Jerusalem and protected that sacred seed to keep the Lord's promise. And what did he do? He took the scepter from the old Jerusalem and moved it to the new Jerusalem.
Which is exactly what Lehi and his family were doing, as far as they were moving from the old, the covenant, which we've talked about in previous episodes here. We've talked about this covenant with God and what happens when people ignore the covenant. And this is the result of that. So God's going to have to reestablish the new covenant. And where's he going to establish it at? The new world.
There you go. So we have this remarkable parallel path going on with promises of Joseph being fulfilled, the promises of Judah being fulfilled, both of those promises being fulfilled in the new Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
So it's an amazing visibility to the fact that the Lord keeps his covenants. He keeps his promises. He never fails to deliver and keep his promises.
That's absolutely true.
And we only know that because of the Book of Mormon. And we can be grateful for Omni, that little part of the small plates that we have in the beginning of the book, that is captured, and that this whole story is even captured there. I don't know if it would have been in the 116 pages. We don't know.
Well, that's just it. And also, if you think about this again, I mentioned this with other episodes, that when it comes down to this, these are the things that were on the small plates of Nephi, and Nephi said that this was the more spiritual account. Apparently, Nephi felt that these things, like in Omni and so forth, that these things were more of a spiritual thing than a temporal thing. Mm-hmm. Why did he think that this was this about Mulek and so forth? That why would he think that that was a spiritual thing?
Yeah, well, and even Nephi never saw the Book of Omni,
yeah.
right? So it was really
right.
it was really Mormon, right,
Yes,
that gathered
right.
those and collected those and found that these were precious and that Lord inspired him to include them
on the small plates.
On the small plates, so that they'd be available for a future date when they were needed. Right, and it's remarkable because Lehi and Nephi would have never known about Omni. Right, he was their descendant, and so they wouldn't have been included in the books that Lehi, the book of Lehi, if you will, the 116 pages, would not have been in there. They had never known about it. So we can be grateful that those pages were lost so that we could have this new insight that came from, as Mormon put that together, that whole continuous record of the sons of Nephi, the descendants of him, the kings, and so forth. And so what we learn from Omni is that Mulek traveled through the wilderness. So from Jerusalem, it's 100 miles to the coastline, right? Probably to Byblos or Sidon or Tyre. These were three major Phoenician port cities, right? And there's no mention of a ship being built. Rather, the Lord says they traveled through the wilderness and then were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great deep to the promised land. So stop and think. The wife of the king is not traveling alone. She has an entourage. She probably has guards. She probably has a whole collection of people, right? And she has money. She has influence. She has power, authority as the wife of the king, right? So all she has to do is go to this port city, show up, and say, "We want to buy fare to
where you guys been going,
the farthest west place that you can take us," right? And it's to me, I'm convinced that at some point.
So you're talking about they would have to then go through the Mediterranean.
So they left from the
and not like Lehi's ocean voyage, which goes around Africa. This was a totally different.
This is a much
voyage.
shorter voyage, actually.
Yeah.
And this is the one that we're here to talk about, isn't it? Because should we just move right into that? So,
absolutely.
So we're talking about this voyage, okay? The Phoenicians before Columbus voyage, right? It's the same ship. This is the same ship that circumnavigated Africa, but this time, instead of going around Africa, it's leaving out of the Mediterranean, starting in Carthage, Tunisia, which was a major Phoenician trading center, which is in the northern Africa area in the Mediterranean Sea, about halfway through. And this is where I joined the expedition.
Nice. And
was able to spend about 10 days prior doing a lot of research, both in Turkey and then in Tunisia, touring all over that area, being led by some really, really smart, intelligent historian people who were teaching me all about Phoenician civilizations. Absolutely fascinating. We could go on and on and on about that.
What were the Phoenicians doing? Why did they have such a formidable? I mean, weren't they known as the first great seafaring people?
Yeah, they were.
Why were they
great seamen?
What caused that?
This little thing right here. Okay, not wood. Not wood, but what's inside, okay? So what it says here in French is pourpre de Carthage, okay? Purple of Carthage. And so in here, you'll see...
Can you see that?
Yeah. So first of all, we'll show you these shells. These are murex shells. It's a kind of mollusk, or a snail, if you will, sea snail, that is abundant in the Mediterranean area.
The whole Mediterranean, or just in a certain area?
Almost the whole Mediterranean. You can find these everywhere. These are deep sea snails. They're not right up on the beach, though. They're not something you can just walk down and find. Mostly these are found by divers, sponge divers, things like that today, or fishermen when they fish and throw their nets down, and the fish get caught in the nets.
Yeah.
Then when they pull their nets in, what happens is they leave their nets out all night, and then they come the next day and they pull them in. And during the night, when the fish are stuck in the nets, these fish come and begin feeding on the fish. These snails. These snails come and begin feeding on the dying fish. Yeah, that's where they get. Okay. So they're little meat eaters. And so when the fishermen pull them in, they throw these snails out, or they want to get rid of them, so they'll throw them in a bucket, and then they'll give them to my friend who made me this special little box, okay? And his name is Gassan, and he was an amazing tour guide for us and teaching me so many things. And he taught us about how they could extract from these shells the purple dye. And purple shows up in the Bible. Color. Yeah, shows up in the Bible in many places, and it's always associated with wealth, great wealth, even greater than gold, because purple is actually more rare than gold. So let me give you an example. These 3 snails, all the purple in their bodies would...
Is it the shells or the snails themselves?
Okay, it's the snail meat inside. So they literally have to take a little hammer and tap it in the right place, and you'll break the shell open, and then with tweezers you pull out a little tiny gland. It's smaller than a pencil eraser, and you pull that little gland out, and that little gland might be enough dye to dye about half of this piece of yarn.
What kind of yarn?
This is wool. This is wool.
Okay.
It's a piece of wool. So you could probably dye a piece of yarn about that long with one snail. So do the math. It takes thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of snails to dye any significant amount.
Like a tunic,
like a whole
or
robe
like
or a tunic.
that,
Yeah.
Wow.
And the dye itself is very unique. It's first of all, it's not purple. When it comes out, it's yellow. So you can't even detect that it's purple. The whole discovery of dye is fascinating.
It doesn't even look like it's
No,
purple?
It doesn't even look purple. I used to think, well, maybe they sprayed it out like an octopus or something like that, the ink or whatever. No, it's nothing like that at all. In fact, to this day, they really don't even know what purpose it serves inside the snail. It's just part of their body and its anatomy that hasn't been sorted out. But it comes out in a variety of different colors depending on the variety of snail. Sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's purple. The more red purple that it is, the richer, the more valuable, the more rare. And anyway, when they get all this, they collect a whole bunch of it. Now, what I have here is a little vial of dry powder. This is actually purple dye, okay? And when you pour that into a solution, a water solution, the water turns yellow.
It doesn't turn purple.
It doesn't turn purple. It turns yellow. And then you would fill a jar, like Gassan showed us. You fill a jar with this and the water, and then you put the material down in there, or the yarn, or whatever, the silk, whatever you're trying to dye, and you let it soak for like 24 hours. Then you take the material out, and now what happens to dye when it's exposed to the sun?
It usually fades.
It fades in the sun.
It fades.
Not purple dye. It cures in the sun. So it comes out looking white, and it turns deep, deep purple. The longer it's exposed to the sun, the richer the color becomes.
So will it continue to do that over time?
Over time, it never fades.
Wow.
Yeah, they have purple. They still have some samples today, 3,000 years old, that are still purple.
They're still purple.
Yeah, that doesn't exist. There's no other kind of dye that has that property to it. So that's what made it so unique and special. And there's a whole story behind how it was discovered and so on and so forth, which we don't want to go into right now. But the point is, it made the Phoenicians incredibly rich. Okay, so just for example, this little bit right here that's in this bottle is $160 worth of purple dye. Okay, wow. In today's numbers, you could easily fill a ship like the one we were in with $50 million worth of purple dye. That we had, and that's why out of the Phoenicians came the concept of insurance. They actually invented insurance, right?
Insure their shipments?
Yeah, so that the traders would come to them and say, we want you to carry this, and they'd say, well, if we lose it, we're not responsible. And they say, yeah, you are. And they said, well, then you got to pay us, right? So then that funded their whole military vessels that they then built, and they would follow these merchant ships and protect them.
So they had an
from
entire entourage of ships, basically, like we do with our aircraft carrier groups and so forth, today we have all the support ships around the main carrier.
Exactly. Same kind of thing.
Phoenicians did that.
Phoenicians did that. Phoenicians had a very, very sophisticated defensive system. In fact, we could go on to that, an amazing discussion with that I can't even get into right now. But what they had, they had extreme wealth, okay? Yeah. And they were trading in all kinds of different things, glass, in precious metals, in the dye, and other things that they were getting from all over the world. Okay. Now we don't know how far all over the world, but some of us might suggest they were even getting things from the New World,
like copper.
For example, copper. And there's a great example about copper we could talk about. So anyway, this voyage that I was on started in Carthage, Tunisia, with the intent of reaching the New World. Okay, in a 600 BC vessel. And so, in effect, remember the first voyage wasn't intending to reach the New World, and it never did. It got close, but it actually circumnavigated Africa and headed back into the Mediterranean, and so it never touched the New World. But it was about 3 days away from landfall in Cuba.
Days away from landfall,
right? But nevertheless, it never did make contact because that wasn't its intent. But this voyage, the intent was to show that the Phoenicians were capable of reaching the New World 2,000 years before Columbus. So I was on the trip.
Tell us how long ago this happened for you.
So for me,
when did you leave Carthage?
On September 28th of 2019, and I was away for 7 weeks, on the ship for 3 weeks, full sailing, and we went, as I expect, we had a number of days, and then we experienced some very severe storms, which actually caused damage to our boat, and we broke the sail. Or not the sail, the mast. The mast. Yeah. The top end of the mast got cracked, which sent us into Algiers for repairs. Algiers is a closed country, so a really interesting episode there.
I remember some of your pictures.
Yeah,
they had the Algerian Coast Guard and so forth out there.
We shall escort you from here. Kind of things, and their bullhorns. They came out to meet us, but we went in, and they had their submachine guns as we went into the port and everything. It was a really interesting place, kind of like going back in time, like a Soviet world. But anyway, we were there 3 days making repairs and so forth, and then left from there, headed to Gibraltar. You've all heard of the Straits of Gibraltar. That's where the Mediterranean and the Atlantic connect. And so then in Gibraltar, we had another week of a lot of research going on there. Lots of Phoenician museums and artifacts are found in Gibraltar. And then from there, we moved on to Cadiz, Spain. Cadiz is a fascinating place. We've all heard of Jonah and the whale.
Yeah.
And Jonah was on a ship trying to get away from the assignment that the Lord gave him back in Israel. Jonah says, I'm not going. Right? Yeah. And so he got on a ship with the intent to sail to the ends of the earth, as far away as he could go. So he was headed for Tarshish. Okay? Yeah. Where is Tarshish? Cadiz, Spain. And he was on a Phoenician boat. So when you read the story about the sailors and Jonah, it's Phoenician sailors, and it's Jonah on a Phoenician boat. Because why? No one else was sailing the Mediterranean in the time of Jonah, except the Phoenicians. Isn't that amazing? So all this stuff is going on that brings us into biblical and Book of Mormon history that we didn't even know was Phoenician.
Yeah, which is just fascinating. In fact, I think it's interesting that the capital city of Phoenicia was Sidon.
Right, Sidon and Tyre.
We have this river in the Book of Mormon called Sidon. Means river of fish, and Sidon means the fishing place, or the place of fish, or something like that.
Can we address that for a second?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So it is a Phoenician word, Sidon. It's pronounced Said in their actual language. Said, Port Said, in their language, and it does mean fishing port, and in their language, and so it is interesting. Okay, so we've got Mulek boarding a Phoenician vessel, sailing to the promised land. I am convinced that somewhere along the way, these sailors were converted. They were converted to the Lord because they settled with Mulek and his entourage. Why do we know that? Because of a few things like this. What language were they speaking? Okay? They didn't meet the Nephites for another 300 and maybe 50 years before they actually first met the Nephites. So they had built a city called Zarahemla, and when they met Mosiah, they couldn't speak to each other, right? Mosiah said, your language has become corrupt. I would submit that they were speaking Phoenician, which doesn't sound at all like Hebrew, by the way.
Even though a lot of their characters are
even
similar.
Though, some of their...
But their actual pronunciation
the
is
words
different.
are very different. And after 300 years of no writing, no written record, I can imagine it would have become even more corrupt.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to note that they named their river that they built their city on Sidon, Said, fishing river. Now, why do we think that means fishing river? Because when the early settlers came into the area, they asked the Indians, what's this river? And they said, Name Zipu, fishing river. So, interesting connection. The Native Americans were calling it the fishing river, and the Book of Mormon calls it the Sidon River, which means fishing river.
Do you think there's any chance that the Mulekites may have left from Sidon originally?
Very possibly. Very possibly.
Meaning Mulek was not possibly born yet. I mean, if that was the case, if his mother was still carrying him, and then she gets into the Phoenician ship, it makes some sense that they might have left from the capital city of the Phoenicians.
Yeah.
And as the queen, basically, she boards on the ship. They head over there. When they get here to America, they decide to call the place that they land after the Phoenicians who had just basically saved them. And that makes even more sense if they brought some Phoenicians with them.
Yeah. Well, they had to, because no one else was sailing those boats. They were only Phoenician sailors that knew how to sail.
Yeah, but who are the Phoenicians? Are they, what race or what nationality are Phoenicians?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I can't fully answer it, but they predate the Israelites. Okay, they were there before Israel occupied that region.
But they're descendants of Shem.
Yes, they're Shemites.
And they're not descendants of Ham or Japheth. So that means that they are basically
they're a Semitic people.
They were Semites.
Yeah. As far as their physical appearances, they would have been
Which also makes sense
Semitic.
why then that they might be more inclined to go ahead and help out Mulek's mom to make the journey, because basically they're the same race, essentially.
Sure. So it gets it gets to a lot of conjecture at this point, but there are some interesting things that we observe. This is one that I found really interesting and discovered this while on board the ship reading the Book of Mormon. It turns out that
must have been a surreal experience.
It was an amazing experience. I really felt like Jonah at times. But the amazing thing was that here's what we learn, is that there are no Phoenician words in the Book of Mormon until after Mosiah meets the people of Zarahemla. And then we start seeing Phoenician language words show up. Beginning with the word Sidon, that's the first. And then remember the coins, the limha of silver and the ontai of this and that and the other. Those are all Phoenician derivatives. And so all that comes from the Zarahemlaites, or their language. And so we have a variety, the Mulekites, the people that lived in Zarahemla, the Mulekites, and we have a whole smattering of Phoenician words that begin after they meet. Now, how could Joseph Smith have known that?
There's no possible way. There's only one way. He was a prophet of God.
And he translated a record the way it was written.
Yeah.
By the gift and power of God.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate your coming and sharing some of this knowledge with us about the Phoenicia expedition, the voyage, and things. Is there any final things you'd like to share with us before we close up?
Well, I would just say that it was humbling to be a part of an expedition that reenacted an actual event from the Book of Mormon.
Actually,
and to be on a ship that literally did both of the voyages.
Where is that ship remarkable. Right now?
And so, I want to close with that. And so the ship itself, after I disembarked in Spain, which is where I got off, the ship continued on to the Canary Islands. And then on November 23rd, it left Canary Islands and never looked back. Okay,
November 23rd of
2019.
Yeah.
And on December 31st, just 2 weeks ago, it landed in the Dominican Republic at Santo Domingo.
So how many weeks is
5
that?
weeks. 5 weeks.
5 weeks from the Canary
the
Islands to America.
Yeah.
Well, to North America.
To the Caribbean Sea. And so
So where is it?
And
It's in Santo Domingo.
It's in
now.
Santo Domingo right now as we speak. On the 14th, or between the 14th and the 18th of January, which is in just a week and a half, the boat will start heading to Miami. And I'm responsible for the Miami landing, and so I'm working on that. And we have a lot of exciting things planned, and it's going to be great. We think it's going to be featured in the Miami Boat Show. We've got a water salute that will be done by the fire department.
Get this on
shooting.
like Fox News or something like that.
I'd love to see it on the news. It'll be a great photo op for any of the media that comes out, and it's going to be a tremendous experience. But we're excited. So the ship will then make landfall in Miami, Florida, and then from there it will begin a tour around the coast of Miami.
Wow.
So that's the plan for the ship. And then after that, the ship, we hope, will end up here in North America as a purchased vessel destined for a museum somewhere.
Wow, would that be amazing? Okay, last thing that we're going to cover. When the Mulekites came over, and obviously we now know their route, even because they're literally replicating the route of the Mulekites, essentially. According to the Lord, in section 125, verse 3 in the Doctrine and Covenants, he talked about, he told Joseph Smith to build up a city on the land opposite of the city of Nauvoo, Illinois, and call it Zarahemla.
That's right.
And the Sidon, or what would you call it? You call it Said.
Said.
Okay, Said. If that was the case, how did the Mulekites get up there, do you think?
That is another area of speculation. It is truly an area of speculation. And I am not absolutely sure whether they came in on the path they were on into the Gulf Coast and sail literally up the Mississippi and using various means to get up the current.
Which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, the Mississippi River is one of those few rivers, because of its sheer size, it's more like a lake moving downstream, okay? Mm-hmm. And it has the prevailing winds are contrary to the direction of the flow of the water. So in other words, while the Mississippi River is actually flowing south, the prevailing winds are blowing north. So
it's very possible you could deploy a sail upstream. And to a certain degree, the ship itself, if it was a Phoenician vessel, like we're thinking it was, it only drafts less than 2 meters deep. That's only about 5 feet deep, yeah. So it can go in very shallow water, and it's very possible that you could sail that a long way up the Mississippi. There's also been speculation that they could have gone around and come up the St. Lawrence Seaway, and under different circumstances than we have today, been able to make it to the Great Lakes and then come down from there. So there's different possibilities.
Clearly, we don't really know.
We just don't know.
Yeah,
but either way,
a couple of different ideas.
It's pretty clear, according to, if we take the D&C 125 reference as literal, and there's no reason why we shouldn't.
Shouldn't we? Right.
That a city on the west side of the major river, that fits perfectly to be Zarahemla, right there across from Nauvoo, which would be remarkable.
And it comes from a revelation straight from the Lord to Joseph Smith. I just find that, again, it's just so many fascinating. So listen, everybody, we want to thank you all for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. I hope that you've learned some things and have a greater understanding and depth of knowledge about what it was like for Lehi and his family to be in this ship, and also about Mulek, and that was just absolutely fascinating as well. So I want you to tune in next week. Next week we're going to be continuing on with this series on the Book of Mormon evidence streaming, and the Come Follow Me program. And we hope that you are enjoying these additional insights, and that it makes your study of the Book of Mormon come more alive and more exciting, and that it makes you basically want to really read, study, and ponder the truths of the Book of Mormon. Because, brothers and sisters, this is how this is the book that the Lord has given us in our day to be able to thwart all of the fiery darts of the adversary. If you want your family to be stronger and you want their testimony to remain bright and brilliant and strong, then you've got to delve into the Book of Mormon. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to give you some reasons to learn more about this. But ultimately, it all comes down to the book. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Book of Mormon Evidence Podcast. If you enjoyed this Come Follow Me supplemental study, click the like button or share it with your friends. Be sure to go to bookofmormonevidence.org or firmfoundationexpo.org, where you can buy tickets to the upcoming Firm Foundation Expo held Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, April 9th, 10th, and 11th in Sandy, Utah. There will be 3 education-packed days, 80 distinguished speakers, 150 presentations and classes on Book of Mormon research, signs of the times, science and religion, self-reliance and health, constitutional studies, and world events.